Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I'm going to be talking today on a presentation called Global Learning in the Post-COVID World, the Role of Internationalized Online Collaboration in Promoting Decolonised Accessible Education. And I'm here presenting on behalf of GLE at Coventry University, specifically from our research theme, Global Learning, Education Without Boundaries. Myself, Ariola, who's also in this presentation, and Katherine Wimpenny, Professor Katherine Wimpenny, my manager. We work together on a number of projects that specialise on global learning across higher education. Amongst other things, we have particular focus on learning in the online space, so COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, virtual learning, and stuff like transnational education, intercultural competencies, third space learning, and particularly decolonisation, which is appropriate for this presentation today. And I'd like to start off with just this it's a fairly long quote here from UNESCO, just from the recent International Day of Education in 2021. And the reason this quote is here is because there's an assumption, obviously during the pandemic, most education has gone online for higher education and university learning. And there's perhaps this mistaken perception that just perhaps everyone can jump online and start to learn, whereas actually the reality is a little bit more bleak. And UNESCO have pointed out that up to 91% of learners across the world haven't had access to schools because they were closed. And this gives us a little bit of food for thought for this presentation around the equality of access to online learning and perhaps what needs to happen post-COVID to enable continuity of education and access to education. So why is online collaboration relevant today? Obviously, the COVID pandemic has brought a renewed focus on online learning. People haven't been able to go to university campuses, to schools to gain education. So online learning has enabled some continuity of education, but has highlighted this idea of access and equity. For those who can access education, great, but for those that can't perhaps access education in online space, we do have to think about this. And this is particularly important because obviously when students come to a university, particularly in the UK context, students are mixing in intercultural, multicultural environments, and that's been taken away during lockdown. And so those sort of innate ability to learn in the third space and to gain intercultural competencies perhaps has been a little curtailed around this. But this is where online collaboration specifically comes in, because that ability to collaborate with other students is quite important. And indeed, it helps to develop these transversal 21st century skill sets. However, it's really important to see online learning in this context as a little bit different to classroom learning. And perhaps one of the pitfalls to online learning, particularly highlighted through the COVID pandemic, is this idea that you can't just dump content. So you can't just recreate the classroom online. So we do have to have a specific attention paid to support curriculum design to enable all students to be able to access online education in a meaningful way. And this leads us to a next point around decolonisation. Decolonisation is so important within this context, and it's quite hard to summarize in sort of one sentence, but decolonisation education infers equity in access and equity of curriculum content. So just to highlight that, European universities and again UK universities tend to rely on practices which are perhaps no longer representative of student and staff demographics. So from the UK example, this does leave many students, particularly overseas students, perhaps not fully represented or perhaps partly disenfranchised by our practices, which are focused mainly on those traditional white English-speaking learners. So the online space does allow people to mix together and to embrace decolonisation, but we can't just, again, simply dump stuff online. We can't just transfer existing classroom practices to be online because it's not sufficient. Further work needs to be done to be able to empower students to learn and empower students to see themselves in the education. So say, for example, if we've got students from Nigeria, how appropriate is a white English language course for a Nigerian learner or even a Chinese learner? We have to think of ways to make it meaningful and relevant to all learners. So just briefly, I'd like to talk about two examples that myself, Katherine and Ariola and GLE have been working on, and those are Ikudu and Jovitol. So both of these projects are EU funded and focus on education in virtual spaces and very much around bringing together learners from the global north and the global south. Jovital and Kudu do both embrace a diverse consortium and aim to develop internationalization of the curriculum, including a decentering of, and non-Eurocentric practices. So there's two different approaches. So Jovital is a project with Jordan, and that is a consortium between a number of Jordanian universities, a number of European universities, and this uses virtual learning environments, VLEs, to bring students together. And particularly there with the Jovital project, we train students to be e-tutors to bring students together. So I'll talk about this in a minute, but e-tutors bridge the gap between academic tutors and the students. They act as an interface to support the online learning. Kudu is a consortium that is between South African universities and European universities, and this takes a slightly different route. We are using COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, with a specific focus on institutional and infrastructure development, and again, a very, very strong frame lens around decolonisation and Africanization. And here are the two consortiums, and hopefully you can see how wide and diverse they are. You'll also notice that the consortium splits are almost equal in most cases, 50-50 in Jordan and Europe, and 50-50 South Africa and Europe. And again, this really helps this idea of true equal partnership and decolonisation, and hopefully allows all the consortium partners to have a voice, and to make sure that the content and delivery that's being created through these projects are meaningful to all. So in terms just briefly, in terms of learning points, both projects have approached the online space, but in slightly different ways. But I believe they have been successful in student engagement and bringing learners together in the online space in slightly different ways. So again, for Jovital, I think the critical success has really been that interface with the e-tutors. So supporting peer learning and enabling students to have feel comfortable in the online space by working with peers. Sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating, I guess, to work fully in an online space and have an academic in the room, particularly when in the virtual room, particularly when students are meant to be collaborating together. So this interface of having e-tutors to support the learning is quite important, as it helps students, I guess, relax and feel more comfortable and competent in using online learning. For Ikudu, the success is a little bit different, but the success has very much been around the internationalization practices themselves and developing this Africanized coil and ways of deconstructing Eurocentric models, particularly to ensure that teaching and learning is really relevant to all involved and the South African students in particular. But that being said, the existence of online learning technologies and online practices doesn't necessarily mean that all students are prepared to learn in an online space. Students might not be familiar with online technologies. Students might not have full access to technology. And sometimes data connectivity is an issue. Although students may have some internet access, it may not be 24 hours around the clock. And it's so easy to forget sometimes, particularly from a European perspective, that not all learners around the world enjoy the same privileges that we have in terms of just being able to jump online on multiple devices. So therefore, we cannot assume that there's universal access to online spaces. We have to consider how all learners are going to be accessing these technologies, accessing the education. And as such, students do need curriculum content to be designed in a way that is appropriate, and not only just for access, but also to be meaningful around decolonised approaches to learning, and also to ensure that intercultural learning is taking place to empower students to learn and ultimately to be able to work in a globalised world. And as such, I'd say that the relevant approaches to collaborative online education still does need attention and further research to ensure that we are preparing students in a meaningful way, and to ensure that we are approaching the UN global challenges appropriately. We generally want all students who learn to be prepared for the world of work. And perhaps this leads on to one important point as well. So most of our research here within GLE, working so far with Ikudu and Jovital, has been really focusing on developing and delivering academic focused training, perhaps, and sort of developing those competencies in the online space. But obviously the students are there as learners, but perhaps we need to harness them a little bit more and focus on that student voice to really understand what students are getting out of the online learning space, out of these experiences, but also what they need and what they require in terms of equity and decolonisation in this educational experience. So yes, it's great to develop all these projects and have all this amazing technology, but we do need to work with students further to really dig down and understand their needs and their realities. So just briefly, some conclusions and thoughts. I'd argue that teaching and learning practices have changed and have been challenged during COVID. And I'd argue that online learning is likely to continue to stay and to increasing importance post-COVID. Although students will return to campuses, I think that the realities of online learning and the shock of what happened in 2020 on the ongoing pandemic will mean that that there will be perhaps a more of a hybrid approach to teaching and learning. But there is a caveat there that recreating traditional classroom environments in an online space is not the answer. We have to think creatively and to really understand how we can work with the online space. And how to get students collaborating together and working around these decolonised approaches to learning. And this is where projects such as Adefila and Ikudu come in. These really do help to illustrate and help us understand more about collaborative online learning. And we do need to challenge assumptions about online learning and how equitable it is. We can't just assume that, oh, every student can jump online, every student can learn online. We do have to really think about inclusivity and how to make all students, how to encourage and enable all students to fully use virtual learning environments, online learning environments. And the bottom line really is further research has to take place in this space. Although there is research out there, we still really know so little about how students operate in the online space, how students learn and collaborate together. And the bottom line really is we have to ensure that all of our students are fully equipped with these 21st century transversal skills so they can go out into the world of work in the future. So really, we all have to come together as academics to fully understand how to support and enfranchise our students to not only learn in the online space, but to develop all these online skills, these transversal skills, to become a global citizen at the end of that educational process. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for your time. I'll leave my email address there and the web address to Glee as well if you'd like to contact us in the future. Obviously, please use the text box if you want to chat and ask questions of us. But thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions and discussing further in the future. Thank you.